What's one moment that made you go, that's it, I'm done?
I wish I could tell you that this story begins with some shocking betrayal that happened overnight, like one of those sudden explosions where everything you thought you knew burns to the ground in seconds. But the truth is that it had been building quietly for years, in little ways that seemed harmless on the surface, yet cut me down slowly until I no longer had the energy to fight it, and it all came to a head on that night when the entire family gathered for dinner. We were all sitting there, plates full, conversations flowing, laughter bouncing from one person to the next, but not a single word seemed to land anywhere near me. The entire room revolved around my sister, Emily, as though she were the sun and the rest of us were just planets lucky enough to circle around her light. They clapped when she shared her news about another achievement at work. They leaned in when she started telling stories about her friends and her upcoming plans. They practically begged her to keep going as though the evening itself depended on her voice filling the air. I sat there, eating quietly, adding in the occasional polite nod, and waiting for someone, anyone, to ask me how my week had been or whether I had anything worth mentioning. Nobody did. The funny thing is, I was not surprised because this wasn't new. This was the way it had always been, and by that point, I had trained myself to anticipate the silence that followed whenever I opened my mouth. Still, that night hit differently. Maybe it was because I had actually accomplished something myself that week, something that mattered to me, something that I thought my parents might at least acknowledge, but when I started to say it, when I tried to cut in between Emily's story and the next round of questions, my father just raised his hand slightly toward me like he was signaling me to hold on for a moment. And then he turned his head back to Emily as if what I had to say could wait until the world stopped spinning. And once again, my words went unsaid. I could feel myself shrinking in that chair, the way you do when you know there's no place for you at the table even though you're technically sitting right there. So instead of forcing myself into their spotlight, I kept my mouth shut. When the plates were empty and the laughter carried into the living room, I gathered the dishes. Nobody asked me to do it, nobody even noticed. They just let me walk around clearing everything like I was invisible help. Not once did anyone thank me or glance my way. My sister didn't offer to help, and my mother was too busy fussing over Emily's hair, laughing at some little joke that wouldn't have made sense to anyone else. You would think that by now I'd be used to it, and in some ways I was, but there's a different kind of ache when you realize that invisibility is no longer an accident. It's a choice they've made over and over again, and the longer you sit quietly in it, the easier it is for them to keep choosing it. I remember standing there with my hands in soapy water, staring at the plates stacked high, and feeling this slow boil in my chest. Not anger exactly, but something heavier, something closer to grief. It wasn't about the dinner or even about that night. It was about every single time I had been brushed aside, every single time my words had gone unheard, every single time my parents looked at Emily like she was the best thing they'd ever done while I was just background noise. When everyone finally left, when the house grew quiet and I was lying in bed trying to shut my mind off, my phone buzzed. It was past midnight, and I almost didn't pick it up, but curiosity got the better of me. The message was from Emily. Her words were short, rushed, and sharp in the way only she could manage. "Did you say something to Mom? She's been crying nonstop." I stared at the screen, reading it over and over, and felt that same weight in my chest shift into something else entirely. Because the truth is, I had said something. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. Nobody at the table even noticed when the words slipped out of my mouth, but my mom had. And whatever she had been holding onto all evening had cracked wide open because of it. Emily didn't know what I had said yet, and she didn't know why it had cut so deep, but she knew enough to be afraid, and for the first time in a long time, I wasn't the one sitting quietly on the outside. For the first time, the silence was on her. And lying there in the dark, phone glowing in my hand, I realized that maybe being invisible had its advantages after all, because nobody notices when you're watching, nobody realizes you're listening, and when the time finally comes to speak, the smallest words can land like bombs. What Emily didn't understand yet was that I wasn't planning on staying invisible forever, and that midnight message was only the beginning. People often assume that revenge comes in explosions, in screaming matches or dramatic public scenes. in moments that leave no doubt about who struck first and who got hit hardest. But in my life, I learned early on that the most powerful form of revenge is usually the quiet kind, the kind that slips into the cracks nobody notices until the whole wall starts crumbling, and for me that meant paying attention. Remembering every conversation, storing every moment when someone showed me their real face, because while Emily was always the golden child who got to shine, I was the one in the background collecting truths that everyone else was too busy praising her to see. I was not the sibling who shouted when something was unfair, and I was not the daughter who argued with my parents when they brushed me aside, because I understood that yelling would only make me look bitter, petty, and small, which was exactly how they wanted to see me, so instead I kept my voice even, my presence light, and my ears open, and over time I became the one person who knew more than I was ever supposed to know. I knew about the time Emily lied about where she was and came home drunk at 17, and I knew exactly how my mother covered for her so that my father never found out. I knew about the quiet loan my parents gave Emily when she was drowning in credit card debt in her 20s, the one they never mentioned in front of me even though I was told repeatedly that we can't just bail out mistakes. I knew the way Emily whispered about Dad behind his back when he lost a promotion, saying he was weak for not fighting harder, and I remembered the way Mom's face tightened when she heard it but still said nothing. So when I sat at that dinner table and listened to them cheer for her again, and when I finally let a single, almost offhand comment slip out, I knew exactly where to place it and how it would land. Nobody else caught it. Their laughter rolled right over me as usual, but I saw the way my mother's fork stopped halfway to her mouth, the way her smile faltered for just a second, and that was enough to tell me I had found the crack. It was not a big accusation, it was not even a sentence anyone else would have thought twice about, but to her it was a reminder of something she had buried, something that she had hoped would never resurface, and I knew right then that silence was not weakness. It was a weapon, and I had finally started to use it. That is why the midnight message from Emily didn't surprise me as much as it probably should have, because if Mom had been crying nonstop since the dinner ended, it meant the little seed I had dropped had already taken root, and now Emily was scrambling, trying to figure out what she had missed. The satisfaction of reading her panic on my phone was something I could barely put into words, because after years of being ignored, I was suddenly the one who had power. Not through noise or attention, but through the things nobody else realized I had been holding onto all along. The hours after that message were filled with a strange, almost electric calm. I didn't reply to her right away, because I knew the silence would bother her more than any answer I could give, and in the morning, when I finally checked again, there was another one waiting. What the hell did you tell her? She won't even talk to me now. That was when it hit me fully. Emily was not afraid of me. She was afraid of what Mom believed I knew, which was far more dangerous. I didn't need to defend myself. I didn't need to justify what I had said, because for the first time Emily was on the back foot, chasing me for answers, and that role reversal was almost intoxicating. Years of being treated like background noise had conditioned me to think I had no leverage, but I had been building it all along, brick by brick, moment by moment, until one small, deliberate comment was enough to send cracks through the image of perfection they had worked so hard to keep polished. And while part of me wanted to explain, to throw the truth out in the open just to see their reactions, a bigger part of me realized that the real strength was in not giving Emily clarity, because the unknown was more terrifying to her than anything I could say outright. So I let her sit in her panic, I let her stew in the silence, and as the day stretched on, I started to think about what would come next, because I knew this wasn't over, and I knew she wasn't going to leave it alone. By the end of that night, I was no longer just the ignored sister who cleared plates while everyone else celebrated. I was the one holding the quiet weapon they didn't even know I had been sharpening for years, and as much as Emily wanted answers, she had no idea that I was only getting started. When Emily finally called me, her voice didn't carry the smug confidence she usually wore like armor, the kind that made her sound as though she was always in control of every conversation. But instead it carried something sharper and far more satisfying for me to hear, a tone laced with panic, suspicion, and just enough desperation to let me know that for once she was not sure how to handle me. And as she spoke, I realized that all those years of being brushed off had finally given me the patience to let her unravel on her own. She started with accusations, asking me what I had said to Mom, insisting that whatever words came out of my mouth had twisted everything, because apparently now Mom wasn't eating, wasn't sleeping, and barely spoke 2 sentences without breaking into tears. And Emily's problem was not really the fact that Mom was upset, but the fact that for the first time in her life, Emily was not the one holding control over how our mother felt. I listened, because I wanted to, not because I needed to defend myself, and when she demanded that I explain, I asked her calmly why she thought it was my words that carried all that weight. Why she believed that after decades of being the invisible one, my voice suddenly had that kind of power, and she hesitated just long enough for me to know she was scared of the answer. Emily tried to regain her footing by telling me that I was always difficult, always the child who made things harder, the daughter who looked for problems instead of appreciating what she had, and I laughed quietly into the phone. Not because it was funny, but because the story she told herself was the same one my parents had repeated for years whenever they didn't want to face the truth, and hearing her cling to it felt like proof that her pedestal was starting to crack. I told her that being difficult was just another way of saying I refused to stay silent when something was wrong, even though they had all gotten used to pretending that silence was the same thing as peace, and that the problem was not me. The problem was that peace for them always meant swallowing anything that made Emily look less than perfect, while I was left to choke on it alone. There was a pause on her end, the kind of pause that tells you someone is trying to come up with the next line in a script they've been rehearsing for years. But for once her lines weren't working, and when she finally spoke again, the sharpness in her voice was replaced by fear. She asked me directly if I had told Mom about the time she borrowed money and never paid it back, or about the night she disappeared and Mom covered for her, or maybe even about the way she talked about Dad behind his back. I didn't confirm anything. I didn't deny it either. I just let her hear the quiet in my voice and said that if she thought Mom was crying over some single secret, she probably needed to take a step back and think about all the things she had hidden over the years. Because maybe the weight wasn't in my words, but in her actions finally being dragged back into the light. And then, almost casually, because I wanted her to feel it land, I added that if she thought Mom was upset now, she should probably ask her what she told me about Dad's promotion years ago. Because maybe the story they had both carried around about why things changed in our family wasn't as clean as they liked to believe. The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that I could hear her breathing, shaky and uneven, and in that moment I realized how much power lies in withholding, in leaving space for someone else's imagination to fill in the blanks. Because no matter what I actually said, Emily was already writing her own version of events in her head, and that version was scaring her far more than the truth ever could. She finally muttered something about me trying to destroy the family, about me being jealous, about me not knowing when to stop, but her voice was unsteady, and instead of making me feel guilty, it made me feel something close to relief. Because for once I wasn't the one scrambling to explain myself, I wasn't the one begging to be heard, I was the one letting her chase her own tail. When the call ended, it wasn't with a resolution, and it wasn't with reconciliation either. It was with the sense that something irreversible had shifted. Because Emily had finally seen that I was not just the sister who cleared plates while she was celebrated. I was the one who had been paying attention, waiting for the moment when all her carefully polished edges would no longer protect her. And as I set my phone down, I knew this wasn't the climax, it was only the opening shot of something much bigger, because the truth was out there now, floating between us. And it was only a matter of time before it tore straight through the illusion they had spent years pretending was unbreakable. The days after that call with Emily felt strangely quiet on the surface, as though the family had collectively decided to step back and pretend everything was fine, but I could feel the tension underneath, the kind of tension that hums low like electricity. Because even when nobody was saying anything directly to me, their silences, their pauses, and their sudden hesitations told me that the illusion they had lived inside for years was starting to fracture. My mother stopped calling me with her usual clipped tone of politeness, and instead, she left long gaps in her voicemails, as if she was trying to figure out how much I actually knew, while my father, who usually avoided any kind of personal conversation with me, started asking questions about my work and whether I was keeping busy, which felt less like genuine interest and more like an awkward attempt to steer me away from whatever storm was brewing inside their home. And then there was Emily, whose usual habit of posting endless smiling pictures and cheerful updates suddenly disappeared, replaced by silence, as though she was too preoccupied to keep up appearances. It was almost entertaining to watch them scramble without me lifting a finger, because all I had done was place a single sentence in the middle of dinner, and now everyone was running in circles trying to figure out whether I had said too much, whether I knew too much, or whether I was holding more than I had already revealed. The power wasn't in some big reveal, it was in the uncertainty, in the way they were forced to question every memory, every choice, every cover-up that had been brushed aside in the name of keeping Emily untouchable. I didn't need to scream or expose them, because the cracks were already there, and my silence was the pressure widening them more each day. My mother, who had always been so careful to make sure Emily's mistakes were shielded and mine were highlighted, began to unravel first. She asked me to come over one afternoon, and while she tried to keep her voice steady, I could see her hands shaking as she poured coffee, and the entire time she circled around the subject without naming it, asking questions like whether I remembered certain events from years ago, whether I ever felt like I misunderstood situations, and whether I had let go of the past. I answered with vague politeness, careful enough not to give her confirmation, but never easing her fear either, because I wanted her to understand that the past she had tried to bury didn't belong solely to her anymore. And when she looked at me with those searching eyes, trying to measure whether I was bluffing, I realized she knew exactly what I was doing but couldn't call me on it, because deep down she also knew that I had earned this moment after decades of swallowing her favoritism and her lies. Meanwhile, Emily's mask of control began slipping faster than I expected. She called me again, not with anger this time, but with a desperation that sounded almost foreign to me, because the sister who had spent her entire life being praised, celebrated, and defended was suddenly the one begging me to explain what was happening. She accused me of turning Mom against her, she accused me of twisting stories, and then she broke down crying in the middle of her rant, blurting out that Mom barely spoke to her anymore, and that Dad was suddenly distant too, as though the two people who had built her pedestal were finally backing away from it. Listening to her crumble like that should have made me feel guilty, maybe even compassionate, but instead I felt a rush of something I couldn't quite name. Maybe validation, maybe liberation, because I had been waiting my whole life for her to understand what it felt like to be on the outside looking in. The real turning point came when Emily showed up at my place one evening, unannounced, her eyes red and her voice shaking. She didn't come in with threats or arrogance. She didn't even bother pretending she was in control. She just stood there in the doorway and said, "Please, just tell me what you told her. You're destroying everything." And for a moment, I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because she still didn't understand that I hadn't actually needed to tell Mom much of anything. The destruction was coming from their own choices, finally catching up with them. All I had done was stop protecting them with my silence. I let her talk, let her spill her panic, let her twist herself into knots trying to convince me to explain, and every word out of her mouth confirmed just how badly the collapse was spreading. The golden child was no longer untouchable, the family's foundation of favoritism was no longer steady, and for once I was not the one being asked to make myself small for the sake of peace. I was the one holding all the cards. And when I finally told her that maybe instead of asking me what I said, she should be asking Mom what secrets she had been hiding all these years, her face went pale, because she knew I was right. As she left that night, still shaken and still desperate, I realized the irony. The family who had worked so hard to keep me invisible had finally made me the center of their world, not by giving me attention or love, but by trying and failing to undo the quiet damage I had unleashed. And deep down, I knew the collapse wasn't finished yet, because there was still one final move left to play, one that would make sure none of them ever looked at me as invisible again. By the time everything reached its breaking point, the house that once felt so untouchable, so carefully constructed around Emily's perfection and my silence, was already hanging together by threads. And I knew that if I wanted my victory to mean something more than a moment of chaos, I needed to make one final move, something that would settle the imbalance once and for all. Not by screaming or lashing out, but by delivering the kind of truth that couldn't be brushed aside, and the irony was that it was not even a secret I had to dig for. It was one my mother herself had let slip years ago when she thought I wasn't really listening, the kind of careless confession that stays buried until someone finally decides to use it. I remembered sitting with her after my father lost a promotion, watching her drink wine and mutter bitterly about how Emily had been told things I was never allowed to hear, about how she had promised to protect Emily's image at all costs because that child can't handle failure the way you can, and those words had carved themselves into me, not just because of the insult, but because they revealed the truth about how different the rules had always been for us. So when the tension finally boiled into a confrontation, my mother crying at the kitchen table, my father pacing like he wanted to fix something but didn't know where to begin, and Emily glaring at me as though I was holding their entire lives hostage, I didn't shout, I didn't point fingers, I didn't throw every detail I had collected across the years in their faces, because that would have given them something to fight back against, and instead I simply asked my mother why she thought Emily needed her protection so badly, and why I was always the one who had to swallow silence in the name of family peace. At first she deflected, as I expected she would, with mutters about responsibility, about keeping the family steady, but then I reminded her of that night, of those exact words, and the room went still in a way that told me Emily had never heard them before. Emily's face shifted instantly, the confidence draining from her eyes as she realized that the pedestal she had been standing on all these years wasn't built out of her own achievements, but out of my mother's constant cover-ups, sacrifices, and selective blindness, and for the first time, she wasn't angry at me, she was angry at Mom. She demanded explanations, she demanded to know what else had been hidden, and she looked at our father with that betrayed expression that comes only when the golden child realizes they weren't golden by nature, but by design, crafted and maintained at the expense of someone else's silence. My father tried to calm her down, tried to dismiss it as something taken out of context, but by then it was too late, because Emily had already seen through the illusion, and I didn't need to add another word. I didn't need to shout about the loans, the nights out, the lies whispered behind closed doors, or the favoritism that had defined our entire upbringing, because they were now fighting among themselves, their loyalty cracking in ways that couldn't be patched back together. And I sat there watching as the weight shifted permanently off my shoulders and onto theirs. It wasn't clean, it wasn't pretty, but it was undeniable, and it was mine. What satisfied me most wasn't Emily's tears or my mother's shame or my father's discomfort. It was the fact that for the first time in my life, I wasn't the one being questioned, dismissed, or ignored. They were forced to face what they had done, and they could no longer bury it under the excuse of me being difficult or jealous, because the truth had come out of their own mouths, their own choices, and their own cracks in the story they had tried to protect. When I left that night, I didn't slam the door, I didn't deliver some dramatic final speech, I didn't even look back to see how they sat in the aftermath of it all, because I didn't need to anymore. I had made my move, and it was the kind of move that didn't need repeating, the kind that would linger in their heads long after I walked away. Emily would never again see me as the invisible sister clearing plates. My mother would never again believe I had no power, and my father would never again mistake my silence for weakness. I know some people would ask if it was worth it, if turning the family against itself was too far, if maybe I should have let things stay quiet, and I can't answer that in a way that would satisfy everyone, because the truth is that I wasn't looking for approval. I was looking for justice, and for once I got it. So when I finally sat in my car and let out the breath I had been holding for years, the only thought that settled in my mind was simple. I didn't destroy the family, I just stopped pretending I was never part of it. And the difference between those two truths is the reason that, for the first time in my life, I felt like I had actually won.